All right, next up is approval or request to approve a number of district work plans. We have 5 different documents, and we've seen these over the last 4 or 5 months. And for approval tonight, we're going to break them out and go through them one at a time. And Dr. Cook, do you want to kind of lead the way on this, or do you just want me to go for it?
So yeah, I would actually prefer that if you just go down the line, and we've got individuals on our team ready to take any and all questions for each one. So for the instructional framework, I'm going to ask Dr. Orozco to avail herself for questions.
Okay, thank you. So the first one up was the instructional framework, and I believe this was the first document that we received. Going way back, is that right? Yeah, back in February. Is there any questions for Dr. Orozco regarding the instructional framework? Okay, Dr. Orozco, looks like you're off the hook tonight. Is there a motion to approve the instructional framework as presented? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries, Ms. Town.
Thank you.
Next up was the curricular management plan. And we saw this on March 2nd. And there was a summary document in our packet as well as the full document. I believe we just had the one edit on that, just to clarify that the authority to approve curriculum belonged to the board, not the superintendent.
Correct. And I would ask that our Director of Curriculum, Katie Groutman, stand for any questions on that.
You can stay seated, Katie. No. Any questions for Katie Groutman on the curricular management plan?
I do have one question. I am wondering with the state review of curriculum standards, how, and the new committee that's being formed at the state level, how that might impact this plan, or if it just kind of will fall on top of it as we go forward. I'm kind of wondering that, and maybe Dr. Cook, you could answer that, or Katie could.
Let me take a shot at that first, and then if Katie wants to lean in, she's more than welcome to. As if you don't know this, it was in Idaho Ed News, and there's quite a bit of chatter about it right now, that there's some review of curricula that's going on at the state level, and that there's a legislative team that are going to do some review work. The thing that I think that would be the most accurate statement at this point is we believe that the plan as it's written is agnostic to any specific curricular recommendations that would come from the state, and it's more about how we would approach curricular management in our district and how we would write that curricula to support the work of the teachers in the classroom. And I think that is, while it's always a challenge when curricula gets changed outside of the hands of people that are delivering it, we would respond to that as needed, however that goes. But it shouldn't be a large impact to this plan if you guys approve that tonight, because this plan is about how we're going to manage that going on with whatever guidance comes from the state in the very near future, or even in the long term. And Katie, if you'd like to add anything, now's that chance.
I would just concur with you, Dr. Cook, that this plan is agnostic of any particular set of standards. And that being said, the standards, any revision to standards is something that we would definitely have to make part of our curriculum writing process.
Dr. Cook, is there, have they given you any kind of timeline for, I know they've just convened this committee. Are they thinking they'll study it this year and then maybe make recommendations for the next legislative session, or?
They haven't set any hard timelines yet, but they definitely, this was a point of contention last session, if you recall, and I think this is in response to that. And I think it will be fascinating and an interesting test to see if they try to put something out so that it's prepared for this session. I would be surprised. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of work to get something turned around that quickly. I'd be very surprised if they were to have something ready to go by this session.
And do they have superintendents? No, I was just curious on the makeup of the committees, there is some superintendents across the state, or is it not?
Actually, I'm not sure at this point who all, I know there's quite a few legislators. I have not seen names of educators on it yet, but that doesn't mean that they're not on there.
Dr. Cook, may I
Please
add
do.
to that?
Yeah, go ahead, Katie.
I know that we have at least 2 educators on these committees. Jamie Essler is part of the science committee, and Rachel Carnes is part of the ELA committee. I know that we nominated a number of people to be part of these committees, and the State Department chose who they needed to based on their composition of these groups. And my understanding is that they're hopeful to have something available to be implemented and voted on for the 2022 school year.
Yeah, I think I remember from the legislative session is, because of the rulemaking process and all of that was up for debate before the legislature this year. And this was kind of a compromise. And I believe they agreed to continue a status quo for the 1 year and form this committee that would make recommendations. So I think it's their intention to have recommendations for this upcoming session. Whether they will do that or not is yet to be seen, I guess. Hey, any other questions on the curricular management plan? Okay, then is there a motion to approve the curricular management plan as presented?
So moved.
Okay, thank you. It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries, Ms. Town. The next plan that is before us is the curricular management plan, and the board first saw this on April 6th at our meeting. Oh, yes, thank you. Comprehensive assessment plan. And that was on April 6th. No public comment was received on that. Is there any questions on that document? I assume Dr. Nelson would be answering those.
That's correct.
Okay, hearing none. Is there a motion to approve the comprehensive assessment plan as presented? Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nelson.
Thank you all.
And the next document is this social emotional learning framework. And let's say we saw this twice. Did we do a whole workshop on this at one point? Or were we just Zoom meeting and it felt like a workshop? I think we did a workshop around it, didn't we? Yeah, we did a workshop and spent a lot of time around this. And then I think talked about it at a meeting after that again.
Workshop, and then 2 weeks later we brought it for information.
Okay, thank you. So we did a workshop around it, then had it for information at the May board meeting. And we did receive a little bit of public comment on this, written public comment. And there's a summary of a few, some responses to some of the comment, and I believe a few adjustments there. Is there any questions on this document?
And I would just add that we did make some changes to the document based upon the feedback that we got from some constituents. And I would just pose that both Keith Orchard and Andy West have spent a substantial amount of time investigating the questions and comments that we got, and put a pretty extensive summary together for why those comments were adjusted for, or that why they were not, if there were comments and questions in which we did not adjust those. And those, both of them are available for questions as well.
I have a few questions. Should I address them to you, or is Andy or Keith? Yeah. The first one, I guess, is about, there was a concern in some of the comments about the cost associated with implementing an SEL framework. And I didn't know, is there a huge outlay for our district to go ahead and adopt this framework and moving forward for a curriculum, or, or just talk about what would the cost be associated with this framework?
So I would start with, and I'll kick this over to Keith and Andy. We made a commitment locally that we wanted to support, do a lot of work supporting mental health. And if you think back to the MTSS model, in the lens of you have like tier 1 interventions, tier 2 interventions, and tier 3. When we talk about mental health supports, you talk about tier 2 and tier 3 supports, which is how it's organized for smaller groups of students. And what we quickly discovered as we built out this service across the district is that there's general needs for what we call tier 1, which is access for everybody. And so that's how we shifted gears very quickly from what we called mental health. And we actually had a long conversation with why we felt like we needed to stop calling it all mental health and start talking about social emotional learning. And so when we decided to shift gears to talk about social emotional learning, it was so that we could have influence on all 3 tiers now, not just in kids that maybe needed therapeutic services or some kind of support. And that's the beginning of this. And so you could argue theoretically that social emotional learning is already the cost of bringing in these positions and the training we're doing with teachers. And what more we would be adding as we build in supports to that remain to be a part of the plan as we expand those services. We've also talked about in the provision of some of these services, there's overlap with some people that work in our special ed department that we may even consider reconstituting into a completely different department. So this is going to get really challenging to track as far as if we are instituting programming. When people ask about social emotional learning, we don't approach it as programming. We approach it as foundational services that we're going to be providing for our kids all across the system and creating that environment that maximizes their ability to walk into a classroom and be highly functional and prepared to learn with all of the supports they would need. So it doesn't necessarily constitute programming when we talk about that. And so when we ask that question, it's going to be a tough answer, and that sounds a little difficult, but the truth is this is going to become part of the fabric of how we function, and that's why we called it a framework. I'm going to ask Andy and Keith if they have some additions they'd like to add to that, but at least that is a starting point.
Thank you, Dr. Cook and members of the board. I don't have much to add. Next year, this coming year, we are operating full speed ahead with intervention should be in all schools and support in all schools with a very minimal budget. So the idea that social emotional learning is a thing that will need to be purchased is not accurate. We hope to join with and be a part of all of the initiatives as they grow so that social emotional learning is baked in what we do as a school district. And so, like Dr. Cook said, you could certainly tie professional development back to social emotional learning, but it won't be just that. It will be a continuum of services and things that we offer to students, to families, and in partnership with the community. And it isn't necessarily a thing that is expensive. It'll just be how we move forward and do things.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that it's not a one-time expenditure, that we're investing millions of dollars into a framework that a lot of these services we've been providing over the years, and now we're kind of reconsolidating, and it's not like we're purchasing curriculum to be teaching to the community about a framework. So thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
The next question, and this was one of the comments we received, and Andy, you might be able to help me with this. They were curious on how we're going to evaluate the competencies, and so I kind of read through. Do you have any example maybe that you could give us on how you might evaluate if a student is learning the competencies, or what will the assessments look like, I guess?
That's a great question, and will absolutely be part of the how. This framework is to say what we need to do, and what we need to do is make sure that what we are doing in the schools, and particularly in the classroom and with students, is effective. The next step is absolutely that how, and there are some good measures out there. Most schools use a combination of, more not survey-based, but observational assessment combined with feedback from parents and feedback from the community. So I don't have a great specific answer as to we're going to do exactly this and then exactly that, but we do know that one of the core components is that we have to evaluate data and evaluate the interventions that we're putting in place to make sure that they are successful and effective. Otherwise, we're not spending dollars wisely or time wisely as we're working with kids and families.
Yeah, and most importantly, and tell me if I interpreted this right, that we're not necessarily grading a student on how they feel. You know, we're not assessing how they're feeling about these competencies. There's no letter grade associated with learning, social emotional learning, but it's mostly, are the tools that we're using effective in this approach? And so just wanted to clarify that comment, because I wondered if there was some confusion that we might be judging or grading a student on some of these techniques or tools that we're teaching them, and that's not the case, correct?
Absolutely.
That is
Correct.
correct. And I would just connect this back to, if you recall when we talked about Portrait of a Graduate, that there's so much more than just the written curricula that we're expected to teach students, those skills and dispositions that we want to provide for students. And there are rubrics out there on things like critical thinking, right? And so when we talk about the idea that kids are going to come through our system, K-12, and learn skills, it isn't just that we're going to grade their ability to critically think, but we do have to assess and say, hey, this is how you're handling this. Maybe we can help you do a little better on this by doing the following things. And that's going to be a part of where we're driving this, so that it isn't just, we're going to still grade kids on their performance on assessments that are related to the written curricula, but we're also going to be giving them feedback on how they develop those skills. And this would align with that completely. Social emotional learning is a part of a greater set of skills and ability to self-regulate and co-regulate and help each other. And I think that's part of what we're going to start seeing some of this instruction shift in real time. And it's not in addition to, but it's in how we're going to be delivering those services. So these integrate very, very well.
Okay, any other questions? I have one, if you wouldn't mind addressing, which there was a concern about reporting of data or reporting of, I guess potential kind of misleading information, or that it would be reported and included in student files forever and those sorts of things. Reporting to national database, that sort of stuff. Could you just address that briefly?
Andy, do you want to take that one on?
Absolutely. So we would not be selling any third-party data. Anything that we collected would be obviously confidential. And with regards, again, to SEL and student improvement, it's really areas of feedback and growth. Parents can opt out of any assessment that is not state mandated. So we would be very protective of that information.
And I would just add that ultimately, when we do a lot of that measuring, and the reporting that we would do on that is only at the aggregate level, so it's not at all going to ever interfere with students' right to privacy or parents' right to keep their kids' data safe. We have no intention of taking that data and doing anything with that, with any relationships with any corporations or any companies whatsoever.
And hasn't Idaho really improved, how we report data as far as how it's aggregated, that they're protecting student confidentiality and that we would have to follow the rules that the state provides us? And those are some recent changes, aren't they, to make sure that no student data is ever compromised?
That is absolutely correct.
One of the things that I appreciated that might address some of those concerns as well was that right in the middle of this document on page 10, it lifts up just the family home as well, and that key learning still takes place at home by parents and adults. And I think the community just needs to do that even within this document, it's really recognized that most of a child's formative learning experience will take place in settings outside of school. And so there's a real partnership here, and I appreciate that and recognition of that. I think families need to recognize that, know that that's in here, so.
And we've gotten a couple of questions about teaching of values. And one of the things I would suggest, and it's in the document, is that these aren't necessarily about values, but they're about skills and how we manage those skill developments in schools. And that's part of what we see as our obligation. We're not preaching values, and there's no value system incorporated in a social emotional learning framework. What we are talking about is how do we specifically help students articulate, name, and recognize what those skills are, and then how to get better at each of those skills. Skills that translate into essentially jobs and better opportunity when they're in post-secondary situations.
The last question I had was about the opt-out question, and it might have been answered. I'm trying to remember in some of the feedback that we responded, but is it possible for an opt-out, or is it not because it's kind of woven through the K-12 curriculum?
I think it depends on what you're talking about, opt-out. It's going to be awfully hard to opt out of never being subject to some kind of social emotional learning because it'll be built into the fabric. But if there are certain assessments that parents want to opt their kids out of, we would absolutely support that.
Yeah, I think that was the question was, will they have an opportunity if they're uncomfortable with the SEL curriculum or whatever's being taught at that moment, they could opt their student out?
Yeah, I think the important part of that question that I think is going to be the challenge is it's not a curriculum. It's a how we are incorporating that skill development and the way that we are creating the environment and the culture in the classroom so that it's not a separate piece. It's not like we're doing reading, then math, and social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is building this idea and concept of the framework and how we are going to deliver all of our services, and helps create those competencies with our staff and our teachers so that they know exactly what that training looks like and what those expectations are, and then they take it and implement it in their classrooms. So.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, is there a motion to approve the social and emotional learning framework as presented?
So moved.
Thank you. All right, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, motion carries, Ms. Town. And the last document that's before us tonight is the equity framework. And do we have any questions regarding the equity framework? We saw this at the June board meeting.
I had a question, only in that it says equity framework draft, and all the other ones say final version. So I just wanted to clarify, is this the final version or draft?
No, this would be the final version. We would be taking draft off of the document if it was so approved tonight.
Okay, because all the other ones say final version with edits, and so that just confused me a little bit, so I wanted to make sure that this is the final document we're approving.
It is,
Okay.
and that's a good catch, and we will take note of that, and I would ask that you treat this as the final document, and then we would remove that from it if it's approved tonight.
Okay.
And we also have Kate Keinert. Is Kate available? I don't see her on screen, so I'm assuming she's on, hit the blue arrow.
Good evening. I'm available. I don't have a camera. Sorry about that.
Just a quick comment. I have received some personal comments recently with questions regarding how are we as a school district going to address race, especially in light of just our world and things that are going on. And it was exciting to be able to say, well, on the end of June, we're going to potentially approve just this equity framework, and those race kind of conversations are in here and pointed out. It was exciting just to be able to point out and say that that's coming and it's coming soon, and that's one thing that's, we're looking at equity across the board. And so I think the timing on this is really, really exciting, so.
And I wanted to thank Mary Hamilton for her comments. I thought they were kind of addressing the same issue. And if you could just keep us up to date on the instructional core team, that sounds like in the packet is going to start a conversation about how do we continue this conversation. I'll be curious to hear what they come up with.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points that I would draw attention to. First of all, the equity framework is combining with our policies to ensure that we create an environment where every kid feels like they're included and part of the community that is our school district, and not in a way that is alienating in any way, shape, or form, right? And so this is much bigger than just race. That being said, it is also important for us to note that race, especially now in a very uncertain time, we have to have this conversation at least on some level. And our instructional core team has already started having that conversation about what that looks like as it plays out in our schools. And so the equity framework lives in kind of as the long game, if you will, that we're going to establish this. And if you recall, equity violations in the curricular audit were the number one findings. We had 3 of them. And so this goes all the way back to the days in which we had the auditors here and helping us to determine our best path forward. And many changes have been made based upon that feedback. And so this sets as kind of a standard for the long solution. And I think whether or not the conversation about what do we want to say about what's going on right now in our world, in our nation, or even in our local and maybe more regional communities is another conversation. I can assure you that it's happening at the building level with conversations amongst administrators and staff, and it's also happening among our team with the instructional leaders in our district and what that looks like as we start to establish this kind of turning the corner as we build out this component of our strategic plan. And so we're up to and willing to engage in that conversation, but we felt that it was imperative first to get your support in this framework.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cook. Any other questions regarding the equity framework? Okay, so is there a motion to approve the equity framework as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries, Ms. Town. And that's going to wrap us up for tonight's meeting. A pretty quick session. We will see there's a few more of these plans that are part of the district work plan, or at least one more, the long-range plan. And I know we're going to see that, I believe we're going to see that at our July meeting. So we're getting there. We've created a lot of documents this year.
Steve or Dr. Cook, can you just give us a little bit of feedback on how, now that we've approved these plans, what is the next phase as far as getting them out to your staff and the community? How do you see them interfacing?
Yeah, so the next part of this is to start to establish some of the direction that is going to come out of this and what we will start training on. And we got into a conversation the other day about all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, there's a lot here. And how do we do this in some kind of systemic way that it doesn't just completely overwhelm the system? You know, forget about global pandemic right now for a minute. Just talk about all of there's hundreds of pages of documents now for us to go train on. And so one of the things we said is that what became very clear to us, that all aspects of the plans that we just approved, that you guys just approved, that we just presented to you, can live in the instructional framework, how teachers stand in front of kids and how they deliver those services. And so we're going to start by focusing in on building quality instruction across the district and infusing those aspects of that. And we will be training on that, and we'll make this available. We've been doing some preliminary work with leaders across the district as we start to kind of get this corner turned. Now we've essentially got permission from you guys to kind of go at this full bore so that there's no draft on anything and we don't have to treat it as in the future, this is the direction that we would like to be headed in. So it's going to be really important for us to start essentially implementing that which exists in these plans, but doing it over a period of years, because this is, and I don't mean that we're going to go slow. I mean that there's a lot there to consume, and we're going to have to build that over time. But the primary starting point will be using that instructional framework, because all of those other aspects can come right through that plan.
Do you imagine that these will be published on our district website if anybody is watching and is curious what's there once they're approved? Is that?
They are, and they will be, and we will actually also start trying to make some hard copies where we can and provide those for sure for our building leaders and kind of start walking them through that and what that means as far as the culture of each and every school we have. So,
Is there a formal review of these or a time frame that it's anticipated? I was just envisioning like a book, and we're going to have this book of all these drafts. I know long range, we've already talked about how that will be something that is a living document, and I know it's intended that these are too, but is there anything that is in place or any agreement as to when those might come back up for review or future boards might look at those?
so one of the plans that we haven't started yet that will be coming is, and we got to come up with a better name for it, but right now it's the systems performance plan, which is this idea that we're going to look back on all of this and then say, how are we doing? Because if we're investing anything that isn't improving the system and making it better or is a waste of resources, our job is to inform to you that we've got to make better decisions. And so that systems performance plan is exactly that, which is, these are kind of the what. The next plans are going to be how then do we make this sustainable over time, which would include how long is this going to take, and kind of that, how cyclical does it become, and what are those benchmarks as we continue to grow it, or shift gears because it's not working, or we need to change our focus and bring that back in front of you guys. So this process is probably about a 3 to 8 year process with Once you get like 2 years in, you start bringing it back and say, here's how we're doing and here's how we're changing. Additionally, we're gonna, we've talked about one of those plans. This is actually a finding out of the audit as well, which is that performance-based budgeting. Because if we're doing a good job on systems performance, we're telling you what's working and what's not working, which is going to help us inform how do we spend our money and what is it that we need to invest in and what is it that maybe we need to stop investing in. And those two things are all at least on the next kind of stages to build out. So, and then the next plan would be building out those systems that support that growth, that tracking, and that development. So like almost like an improvement model, so that we can show these are the goals that we're setting as a district. Here's how we're reaching for them, which is part of that kind of systems model. So.
Well, I appreciate that. My biggest fear is you've got this great book, and 10 years from now, it's like, let's get the dust off of that. What is that, and what was in there, and what were we doing with that 10 years ago? So.
Yeah, no, if that's what we were building, then we've spent a lot of time, unfortunately. And so we're excited that this is going to be kind of at the forefront of the work that we're going to be working on for the next several years, and that how it goes, we go. And so I don't anticipate that this will be collecting dust.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for being here, and thanks for those who are online with us. If there's nothing further, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up, and we'll adjourn. We'll be back together next Monday for our regular board meeting. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good night.